All right, so in our fourth video of Unit 2, we're going to be looking at real versus nominal GDP and the GDP deflator. So we're really going to look at the second way of calculating inflation within our country, which is, yet again, the GDP deflator. All right, so let's go. All right, so real v nominal GDP. And so this is something that we covered at the very tail end of our previous video with the CPI, but we need to go over it again. And so before we get into really the actual definitions, right, let's look at this following question. If a country's GDP increased from 4 to 5 billion in a given year, is the country experiencing economic growth? In other words, another way that we can reword this question is, did this country definitely produce 25% more products? Well, the short answer is no. And the reason why that answer is no is because we didn't really take into account inflation. And remember, inflation can be one of two things, right? A general rise in price levels, as you see on the screen, or the reduction in purchasing power of your dollar. And so here, for another example, right, let's assume that in this country that apples are the only thing being produced, right? So in year one, we have 10 apples at $1 each, so our GDP is $10. In year two, we have 10 apples, we're still selling 10 apples, but now each apple is $1.25, and our GDP is now $12.50. So based on this example, we know that our GDP is rising, but the country is worse off. The reason why the country's worse off is we're producing the same amount of apples. However, right, the apples now cost 25 cents more. And so it looks like, right, that our country is experiencing economic growth because our GDP is increasing. However, we're not actually producing more, right? And so this calculation of this GDP right here, right, does not take into account inflation. And so here, we're going to call that the nominal GDP. In other words, the GDP measured in current prices, and it does not take into account inflation from year to year. So what we want to do is we want to look at the real GDP. It's expressed in constant or unchanging dollars. In other words, real GDP takes into account inflation here. And so from this point on, we are going to say, right, what this last point on this screen says, that real GDP is better than nominal GDP for measuring actual growth within our GDP here, within our economy. And the reason why it's better is because we're taking into account inflation or the general rise in price levels here. And so we already went over one way to calculate inflation and how to, in regards to our GDP with the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. A second way is what we're going to go over today, the GDP deflator. And so the difference between the GDP deflator and the CPI is that the CPI really only measures the prices of goods and services bought by consumers within a specific market basket. The GDP deflator, on the other hand, measures the prices of all goods and services that were produced. However, the caveat is it only includes the goods that are produced domestically, right? So you can buy it and produce it and offer a service only within the domestic nation at large. So imported goods are not part of a GDP and does not show up in our GDP deflator. Right? So yet again, the key difference is the CPI only measures the prices of goods and services of some goods within their market basket, while the GDP deflator measures the price of all goods within our market basket, or measure the price of goods and services for everything, right, within the country. So we have a single sort of equation here. The GDP deflator, right, is going to be our nominal over our real GDP times 100. That is our GDP deflator equation. The second equation that you see on the screen, right, is just another way of sort of rewriting this initial equation here, right? Our nominal GDP equals our GDP deflator times our real GDP over 100. It's the same exact equation, just rewritten in two different ways here. So yet again, our GDP deflator equation is just nominal over real GDP times 100. And the equation that you see on the bottom half of your screen is just another way to reword it, another way to rewrite it. So let's go over this, right? So let's look at this example. So if the nominal GDP in 2009 was $25 and the real GDP compared to the base year was $20, how much is the GDP deflator? Well, remember, our GDP deflator is going to equal, right, our nominal GDP over our real GDP times 100. Right? And so here, we know what our nominal GDP is, right? It says our nominal GDP was $25, right? So 25 divided by our real GDP, right? And the real GDP compared was $20, right? And we multiply that by 100. So we do 25 divided by 20, which is about 1.25 times 100. So our GDP deflator gets us to 125, right? It gets us to that index number. Right? So that's pretty simple, right? All right, so what I want you guys to do, right, is to pause the video real quick and find out the answer, the GDP deflator, to this guided practice by yourself. All right, so pause the video, and then we'll go over it together. All right, so let's go over this, right? So yet again, right, our equation is nominal GDP over real GDP times 100 gets us to our GDP deflator. Well, here we know what our nominal GDP is, right? Our nominal GDP is $150 billion, right? So that is going to go on top. We know that our real GDP is $100 billion, so that is going to go in the denominator, right? And we're going to multiply that by 100. So 150 over 100 gets us to 1.5 times 100, which gets us to 150. So our GDP deflator for this question is 150, right? Notice it's not a percent, it's just a pure number. It's an index number. All right, so what I want you guys to do again is to pause the video, figure out the nominal GDP for 2002, and then we'll move on. So pause the video, figure out the answer to this question, and then we'll go over it together. All right, so let's go over this. So here, right, we're going to have to use sort of the reworded equation here to make it a little bit easier, right? So our nominal GDP is going to equal, right, our GDP deflator, let me, for sake of space, right, abbreviate it, times our real GDP, right, divided by 100. And so here, right, we want to find out our nominal GDP for 2002. We know what our GDP deflator is, right? It says the GDP deflator was 120, right? So that's 120 times our real GDP, which we know, right? Our real GDP was $200 billion, right? So $200 billion. And we're going to divide it by 100. And so here, if we just do the math, it's about, I'm just going to get rid of this billion here, right? So 24,000 divided by 100, right? Which should equal $240 billion. And make sure, right, that you didn't forget to add the word billion after it, right? Because we were looking at these GDP in billions and billions of dollars here. All right, so I hope this practice GDP made, or this guided practice made sense for you, because now we're going to move on to a practice FRQ. And so just like the past couple of videos for this particular unit, I broke up one single FRQ into different parts, right, for sake of showing our work in space. So what I want you guys to do right now is to pause the video and figure out the answers for part A and part B. All right, so pause the video and figure out the answer for part A and part B of this 2008 FRQ. All right, so let's figure this out. So here we have Gauland that produces 3 final goods, right? Bread, water, and fruit. The table to the right shows this year's output and the price for each good. And we want to figure out the nominal GDP. And because it asks us to calculate, we have to show our work. And so here, right, we know we have 400 loaves of bread and it costs $6 a loaf. We We have 1,000 gallons of water, and it costs us $2 a gallon. And lastly, we have 800 pieces of fruit, and it costs $2 a piece. So to calculate our nominal GDP, it's just the price times the output. So all we have to do is just do the 400 loaves of bread times the $6 per loaf, plus the 1,000 gallons of water times $2 a gallon, plus, right, the 800 pieces of fruit times $2 for each fruit. And so if we do 2,400 plus 2,000 plus 1,600, right, it should get us to a nominal GDP of $6,000 here. All right, so part 2, or part B. Assume that in Galaland, the GDP deflator is 100 in the base year and 150 this year. Calculate each of the following. Part 1 asks for the inflation rate expressed as a percentage. Well, 1 should be easy, right? It just should be 50%, right? Because if our deflator is 100 in the base year and 150 this year, right, we know that there's a 50% inflation. However, we have to show our work, right? And so remember, our equation to calculate the inflation rate is going to be year 2 minus year 1 over year 1 times 100. So we can just say year 2, 150, minus year 1, 100, divided by year 1, 100, times 100 gets us to 50%. All right, so part B, this year's real GDP. Right? This year's real GDP. So here, right, we have our equation, right? And so our equation is going to be, right, our real GDP is going to equal, right, our nominal GDP divided by, right, we can say really divided by our GDP deflator, right? And then multiply all that by 100, right? So in other words, at the end of the day, right, we should get to $6,000 divided by 1.5, right? Which should get us to our real GDP of $4,000 there. All right, so part C. So I want you guys to pause the video, figure out the answer to part C, and then when you have an answer, come back and we'll figure out the answer together. All right, so part C says, workers have received a 20% increase in their nominal wages. If the workers face the same inflation that they calculate in part B, what happened to their real wages? Explain. Well, here, right, we calculated that there was a 50% inflation rate in part B1. And so here, right, if their real wages, or if their nominal wages, right, so N wages, increased by 20%, but we have 50% inflation, we are going to say, right, that their real wages, so that their real wages would fall. And remember, it's not enough to say it would fall because it asks to explain. So it would fall because, right, nominal wages increased by 20% while inflation rose by 50%, right? So in other words, inflation rose by more than what they received in their nominal wage, right? Which would cause a 30% reduction in the workers' real wages there. All right, last but not least is part D, right? So yet again, pause the video, figure out the correct answer. When you have an answer, unpause it, and we'll go over it together. All right, so here, part D asks, if the GDP deflator in Galaland increases unexpectedly, would a borrower with a fixed interest rate loan be better off or worse off? Explain, right? And so here, first off, right, if the GDP deflator increases unexpectedly, that means there's higher levels of inflation. And so here, if a borrower with a fixed interest rate is paying back their loan with higher levels of inflation, right, that the borrower is better off. And remember, it asks us to explain, right? So because, right, the borrower is better off because, right, higher inflation, leads to borrower, and remember, you want to write with better sort of grammatical structure than I am, right? The borrower is paying back the loan using fewer real dollars. So here, right, the borrower is better off with if the borrower is paying back a fixed interest loan, right, if there's higher levels of inflation, because with the higher levels of inflation, the borrower is actually paying back less money, right? If inflation rose by 30%, right, which is insane, if the inflation rose by 30%, while the borrower is paying off an interest at 2%, when the inflation was like 10% when they initially signed up for the loan, right, then the bank is receiving actually less money, right? And so the borrower is better off in this scenario. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.